Hello again. Welcome to my third video in my series, Charles and Fanny, 19th Century Pioneers for Human Rights. I'm Mary Mitchell. I'm a former school teacher and graphic designer, and now I'm my family's storyteller. In the first video, we introduce you to Charles and Fanny and explain how Fanny developed her life goals. In the second video, we introduce you to a group of people in Boston in 1859. That's 2 years before the Civil War broke out. Charles was living there when he was 31 years old, and these people helped him develop his life goals. He changed from being a Baptist minister to being a Unitarian minister. And most of these people, besides being Unitarians, were abolitionists and suffragists. In this video, we are going to take you to California and introduce you to the people with whom they got involved that started the Unitarian movement out in California and also planted the grassroots of the women's rights movement. So come along for the ride. I think you'll find it very interesting to see what was going on in California in the late 1860s. In the fall of 1859, Charles ran into an old Free Will Baptist associate who had also become a Unitarian. This man told Charles about a minister position in an upstart Unitarian community in Bloomington, Illinois. In around November, Charles moved his whole family, including his frail mother-in-law, to Bloomington. But Charles's wife, Sarah Jane, was also not feeling well. Her health had been on the decline since she married Charles. She felt stomach pain and a lack of stamina, but no one could figure out what was wrong with her. She had good days and bad days. She wrote that sometimes she could clean the house from top to bottom, and on other days barely had the strength to write a letter. All the while, Charles remained active in the Republican anti-slavery effort. Being in Illinois, he got to know Abraham Lincoln. He wrote that on one occasion, Lincoln even dined at his table. One thing that Charles Ames and Abraham Lincoln had in common was that as children they were treated as slaves working as farmhands. But the most current event was the act of insurrection carried out by abolitionist John Brown and 22 other men. They raided Harper's Ferry in Virginia a few weeks before the Ameses moved to Illinois. The backstory is that 3 years earlier, in 1856, a violent row occurred in the Kansas Territory between the pro-slavery settlers and the anti-slavery settlers. The town of Lawrence had been founded by anti-slavery settlers from Massachusetts 2 years earlier. But the Douglas County Sheriff, Samuel Jones, was pro-slavery. He led a raid on the town, which resulted in one accidental death of a pro-slavery man, the destruction of a Free State hotel, and the sacking of Charles Lawrence Robinson's house. Robinson, from Massachusetts, and one of the founders of the town, had been actively working against slavery in the Kansas Territory, which is why Sheriff Jones went after him. In retaliation to Jones's raid, John Brown and a band of his supporters killed 5 pro-slavery settlers living just north of Pottawatomie Creek in Franklin County. The slaughter occurred right in front of the settlers' families. Getting back to 1859, Brown had decided that nothing short of military action would eliminate slavery. His plan had been to capture weapons from the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, then organize a slave rebellion in the South. As we know, 2 members of the Boston Human Rights Group, Samuel Gridley Howe and Theodore Parker, were among the Secret Six who funded Brown's plan. But as history knows, Brown and his gang were overcome, caught, and tried for treason. John Brown was hung for his crime on December 2nd, 1859. Just 2 days later, on December 4th, in one of Charles's first sermons to his new congregation in Bloomington, Illinois, he spoke in support of John Brown. He stated, "For the last 20 or 30 years, John Brown had been revolving in his mind a project for the overthrow of slavery in the United States. Whether he had always thought that violent methods were best, I cannot say. But it is probably what he saw in Kansas that destroyed all hope that the slave hold would ever let go of his victim peacefully. And so, for the last 2 years, he seems to have been diligently engaged in organizing the rash expedition that cost him his life. Reverend Ames's popular sermon was published and circulated. Today, both the Massachusetts Historical Society and Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library hold copies. The Ameses were in Bloomington for 3 years. Sarah Jane's health continued to decline, but there were some bright moments. On May 28, 1860, Charles officiated their daughter Serena's wedding to George Wright of Minneapolis. Serena and George had a baby named Mary a year later. There were also some dark moments. On April 12, 1861, the Confederate Army attacked Fort Sumner in South Carolina, igniting the Civil War. 33-year-old Charles tried to sign up with the Union Army, but they rejected him because he had a weak constitution. He would pay the cost of someone to take his place and work tirelessly during the war, giving sermons to rally the troops. But the darkest moment occurred 5 months after the war started. Sarah Jane passed away. On September 16, 1861, Charles wrote to Serena and George in Minneapolis from Bloomington. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Sarah Jane passed to that higher sphere to which the discipline of duty and sorrow had so long been fitting her. An autopsy discovered that she had been suffering from a diseased pancreas. Charles stayed in Bloomington for 1 more year. A bit of trivia. While Charles was dealing with Sarah Jane's loss, President Abraham Lincoln invited Charles's mentor, James Freeman Clarke, and Julia Ward Howe and others to visit the White House. While on their excursion, James Freeman Clarke suggested to Julia Ward Howe that she write different words to the song John Brown's Body. That's how the song The Battle Hymn of the Republic came about. At the end of 1862, with the war in its early stages, the Unitarian Church, which is based in Boston, sent Charles to minister in Cincinnati, Ohio. Charles and his 7-year-old son, Charles Wilberforce Ames, took up rooms in a boarding house, which is how they would meet Fanny Baker. On June 11, 1863, 2 years after Sarah Jane's death, 35-year-old Charles wrote to his 41-year-old friend Carolyn Healy Dahl back in Boston. We met Mrs. Dahl in Part 2. She was a good friend of James Freeman Clarke and worked for women's rights while her husband lived in India working for the poor. Mrs. Dahl lived alone and had no children. Charles wrote, "My dear Mrs. Dahl, I'm expected to be married June 25th, and to set off with Fanny, my wife, and Charlie, my boy, on the very same morning for Albany, New York, where I am engaged to preach 4 Sundays commencing June 28th. Surprised, are you? So am I. It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. But being wholly at rest in the assurance that it is His doing, I have no room for much but grateful joy. I have known her about 6 months, and He shut us up together in this boarding house, the last 3 of them, without consulting us in the matter at all. Fanny, who is quite as much of a woman as I am of a man, is 23 years old. Not large, but short and sweet, with blue eyes and dark brown hair." As Charles wrote, he, Fanny, and 8-year-old Charlie went to Albany after the wedding. They must have liked it there, because they purchased a home at 7 Lancaster Street and stayed 3 years, until the Civil War ended. According to today's Albany Unitarian Church website, back in 1863, the church was renting a building on Division Street, which was probably the building shown on this map painted in 1853. Today, both 7 Lancaster Street and Division Street are parking lots. 11 months after their marriage, Charles and Fanny had a little girl. They named her Lillian. Meanwhile, in 1864, Charles undertook a project for which Mrs. Dahl helped. Charles had learned the identity of his birth mother, Lucy Anna Thatcher, back in 1848. Her family lived primarily in Maine, some in Thomaston, some in Peterborough, now a part of Warren, and some in Mercer. But they had a lot of connections in Boston, including Mrs. Dahl. After Charles's mother gave him up to foster care, she married. She and her revivalist husband became pioneers in Hill, Michigan, a frontier town near today's Hillsdale. They had a daughter named Harriet, whom they affectionately called Hattie. In 1850, when Charles was about 22, he surprised the little family with a visit on a snowy New Year's Eve. When Lucy's husband was out of the room, she acknowledged Charles, gently letting him know she was indeed his mother, but making him promise never to reveal the story to her husband. I tell you the long version of this tale in my book. For now, suffice it to say that Charles kept his promise, but in 1863, both Lucy and her husband died in Michigan, leaving 16-year-old Hattie an orphan. Charles must have told Mrs. Dahl the story, and that he had never learned the identity of his birth father, because Mrs. Dahl spent most of 1864 writing to various members of Lucy's family, trying to find out who that birth father was. In November, Mrs. Dahl sent a report to Charles about her fruitless search. But Charles was so busy being the pastor of the Albany church and preaching to the Union troops that Fanny had to write back to Mrs. Dahl for him. On November 1st, 1864, she wrote, "My dear Mrs. Dahl, Charles G. has been so busy during the last week, or rather during the last 3 weeks, that he has owned no allegiance to anything save the country. He has spoken nearly every evening for 3 weeks, excepting Saturdays, and preached twice on Sundays." Fanny ended her letter mentioning that Charles W. was doing well, but baby Lillian was ailing. Only a few weeks after Fanny wrote to Carolyn Dahl, on Christmas Day, tiny Lillian died. She was only 6 months old. Now we will take you to California. Shortly after Appomattox, the American Unitarian Association sent Charles to the San Francisco Bay Area to survey religious conditions and organize new Unitarian societies in Sacramento, Santa Cruz, San Jose, and Santa Clara. The church was already thriving in San Francisco. In 1850, only a year after Sutter discovered large amounts of gold, a group of Unitarians formed a church that met in a waterfront meeting house called the Athenaeum on Commercial Street in downtown San Francisco. The group quickly grew out of that, and in 1853 built their first building on Stockton Street. In 1860, the year after Charles and Sarah Jane were in Boston, that group invited 36-year-old Star King, whom we met in Part 2, to be their pastor. King was such an inspiring orator that his church outgrew their first building, and in 1863, the year Charles and Fanny were getting married, built a new edifice on Geary Street, where it still stands today. King was well connected as a Freemason. The Grand Lodge of California had been built in San Francisco the same year the Unitarians founded their first church society there. King rose to the sublime degree of Master Mason in San Francisco's Oriental Lodge No. 144, which is now the Phoenix Lodge No. 144. He served as Grand Orator of the Grand Lodge of California in 1863. King did a lot more for California than serve as a Unitarian minister and lodge member. There are 5 elementary schools in California named after him, and I bet you don't know why. For starts, it was he, not John Muir, who was responsible for Yosemite becoming a national park. Star King visited Yosemite Valley soon after arriving in California. He was so entranced, he drafted landscape designer Frederick Lee Olmsted, famous now for designing Central Park in New York, to help him lobby Congress to set the valley aside to become a reserve. Yosemite would become our nation's 3rd national park 30 years later in 1890. But probably most important, During the Civil War, King encouraged his congregation, fellow Freemasons, and others to stay in the Union. Abraham Lincoln credited him for preventing California from becoming a separate republic. But like so many of the events included in this story, King's legacy has faded since then. That is symbolized by the fate of his statue. It was originally designed and formed by Daniel Chester French of New Hampshire, a friend of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Louise May Alcott's sister May. The statue took its place alongside Junipero Serra in the National Statuary Hall in the United States Capitol. Every state is represented by two statues, just like every state has two senators. But in 2006, a Republican senator authored a resolution to replace King's statue with one of Ronald Reagan. 3 years later, King's statue moved to California. In 2009, it was reinstalled in the Civil War Memorial Grove in Sacramento's Capitol Park, where you can see it today. A second statue of King, also by Daniel Chester French, stands on JFK Drive in Golden Gate Park. Getting back to the 1860s, sadly, King, who'd always been frail, wore himself out. In 1864, the year before his church sent Charles to California, King died of diphtheria and pneumonia. He left some enormous shoes to fill, but Charles wasn't meant to fill them. Charles thought his move was temporary. He found living quarters in San Francisco's Presidio, while Fanny stayed back on Lancaster Street in Albany. She soon discovered she was pregnant. On November 28, 1865, she gave birth to Alice Vivian Ames, my great-grandmother. Charles received the news on January 3, 1866, in a letter from Fanny that had traveled from Albany to Boston by train, south along the Atlantic coast by steamer, across the Isthmus of Panama by train, and north along the California coast by another steamer. The elated Charles told Fanny to stay put with the children on Lancaster Street, but she didn't. Sometime between when Alice was 4 and 6 months old, Fanny gathered up the baby, 10-year-old Charlie, and whatever gear they would need on the West Coast, and followed the same route her letters had taken to California. We know the family was together by the time these photos were taken in San Jose. Penciled on the back, Fanny wrote that Alice was 8 months old. Charles had been in California for a year. The family would stay there for another 6 years, based out of Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz County was one of the original 27 counties when California became a state in 1850. In 1865, as Fanny arrived, the port was just being incorporated as a city. It was the last harbor where steamers stopped before entering the Bay of San Francisco. Charles established 2 churches, one in Santa Cruz and one in San Jose, but he also preached to other communities. Almost 50 years later, in 1913, his daughter Alice will write about the family's time in California in her epilogue to Charles's spiritual autobiography, which I heavily quoted in the last video. Alice was less than 8 months old when she arrived to Santa Cruz, and only 6 or 7 when she left, so she must have been sharing her mother's memories of their experience. She wrote, "Everywhere where 2 or 3 could be gathered together, to Watsonville, Santa Clara, Sacramento, the missionary zeal carried my father. From Santa Cruz, he went over the mountains, driving his own horse 32 miles, often accompanied by Mrs. Eames, and the way shortened by alternate reading of the last new book, as the old horse climbed the twisting roads until San Jose was reached late in the afternoon and another congregation gathered." Alice described California as serene, with health-giving out-of-doorishness. She spoke of California's geology as the greater universe about, and the astronomy as the greater universe above. She wrote, "On many wonderful mornings, there were breakfast picnics on the meadow, caught high up on peaks overlooking the sea, where the broiling of steaks on the live coals alternated with the reading of Emerson. It was fresh and out of doors. Hearts were warm and easily touched. In after years, people known for only a short time were always turning up in Philadelphia or Boston, where they would later live, still with a glow on their faces, to renew the old friendship that still loomed up to them as one of the big things in their lives." Alice wrote that Bret Harte was an intimate friend. His magazine, the Overland Monthly, was always open to the contributions of Reverend Ames, the young Unitarian minister. Alice continued, "There were friendships with people keenly alive. The brilliant Englishwoman Georgiana Bruce Kirby, who had been at Brook Farm, and who, with the celebrated Eliza Farnham, had ventured into this land of romance to try her fortunes. Georgiana Bruce Kirby, who, with Eliza Farnham, was a generation older than Fanny, was connected to the Boston crowd we met in Part 2. We met her briefly when she was in London, working for the Unitarian minister from Boston, Ezra Gannett. Eliza had written 4 books about her life, including California Indoors and Out, that Fanny had probably read. It was published in New York after she returned to that state in 1856. By the time the Ameses reached California, Eliza had passed away at age 49. But Georgiana Kirby was alive and well. Alice wrote that she was the Lady Bountiful of the whole region, passionately eager to bring to her little world of Santa Cruz all the finer influences of the great world beyond the Sierras. Georgiana, a Unitarian, was probably one of the first to join Charles's congregation. She was born in Bristol, England. Her father, a merchant seaman, had died at sea before she was born. Her mother remarried, but still didn't have enough money, which is why she farmed Georgiana out at an early age to work in other people's homes. Georgiana managed to obtain enough of an education to become a governess when she was 14, to a family that took her to Paris, then Quebec, Canada, where she became a teacher. In 1837, she returned to London, which is when she worked for a short time for Reverend Gannett. She followed the Gannetts to Boston, but didn't join Gannett's Federal Street Unitarian Church. She and her brother found Theodore Parker's Transcendental Unitarians more interesting. Through the Transcendentalists, Georgiana got involved in Brook Farm, where she got to know Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller, who was 8 years older. At the farm, Georgiana taught classes in gardening and began to write fiction and short stories. In 1844, she moved to New York, where Margaret Fuller introduced her to Eliza Farnham. Farnham had just become the matron of Sing Sing prison. Georgiana worked at Sing Sing for a year. Eliza was pioneering prison reform, especially for women, but after 4 years, the more conservative trustees chased her out. Georgiana spent the next few years teaching at public schools in Illinois, Missouri, Pennsylvania, then back in New York. In 1850, she borrowed money from Horace Greeley, the owner of the New York Tribune and Margaret Fuller's boss, to travel to Santa Cruz to join Eliza. That's the same year Margaret Fuller died in the shipwreck. Eliza Farnham had arrived in California the year before, which made her a 49er. She lived on a farm that her estranged husband had been gifted for doing some legal work. When the husband died, Eliza got the farm. Georgiana, who, as we said, had taught farming skills while at Brook Farm, helped Eliza for 2 years, producing chickens, potatoes, and fruit. The farm turned out to be too difficult to manage, so Eliza returned to New York. She published a couple more books and many articles, including one on her relationship with Georgiana. It was titled "The Ideal Attained," being the story of 2 steadfast souls and how they won their happiness and lost it not. It was published just after her death in 1865. Meanwhile, in 1852, Georgiana married Santa Cruz's local tanner, Richard Kirby, with whom she had 5 children. She continued to write. Newspapers such as Greeley's New York Tribune and the National Anti-Slavery Standard helped her keep up with the abolition and suffrage movements back east. Wikipedia stated, Georgiana brought to California an intellectual fervor difficult for the pioneer town of Santa Cruz to comprehend. She probably joined Charles's church around 1866. In 1869, she, Fanny, and others in the church founded the Santa Cruz Suffragist Society. 1869 was a momentous year for the women's suffrage associations on both coasts. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's society, run from New York, split from Lucy Stone's group, run from Boston. More on that in a minute. California was a good breeding ground for the women's rights movement. Pioneer men wrote to friends back east to send brides who showed self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency. Gold diggers, cattle ranchers, and farmers had no room for tea parties and lace. When the founders of the state wrote the Constitution in 1850, they guaranteed married women the right to manage their own property. By 1866, women all around the Bay Area were speaking up about women's rights. Laura DeForest Gordon, an attorney who'd recently moved to the Bay Area from Pennsylvania, was pushing for women's rights in Sacramento. Laura was 2 years older than Fanny and 22 years younger than Georgiana Kirby. In 1868, the year before, she'd delivered a lecture in San Francisco advocating for women's suffrage. She was the second woman to practice law in California, but will be the first woman in the U.S. to run a daily newspaper. A former New Yorker named Emily Pitts Stevens advocated for women's rights in San Francisco. She was a bit younger than Fanny and Laura. Emily arrived in San Francisco about 1865, where she started a night school for women. And in the gold mining town of Nevada City, which isn't in Nevada, it's in California, a married couple who were both suffragists brought the suffrage movement alive in gold country. Aaron and Ellen Sargent were Charles's age. Born and raised in Newburyport, Massachusetts, they would have known William Lloyd Garrison and John Greenleaf Whittier. Even though Aaron Sargent was from the Boston area and would become a journalist, lawyer, politician, and diplomat, like Charles, he didn't attend any of the fancy schools that the Unitarian Transcendentalist crowd in Boston did. Aaron spent some time as a printer in Philadelphia, then as the secretary of a congressman in Washington, D.C., before moving to California as a 49er. He was 22 years old and wanted to speculate in gold. In 1852, after Aaron made some money and built a 4-room house on Broad Street in Nevada City, he returned to Newburyport to marry Ellen, who'd been his high school sweetheart. Like 99% of the people who traveled by sea, he took the route across Panama. Only 1% of pioneers sailed under South America. The newlywed Sargents returned to California and started a family in the 4-room house. 17 years later, in 1869, as Fanny and Georgiana Kirby were founding the suffrage organization in Santa Cruz, Ellen established the Nevada County Women's Suffrage Organization. Meanwhile, Aaron established a newspaper and became an attorney. He probably knew Laura DeForest Gordon. He will later serve as a congressman from California and, more significantly, as one of California's 2 senators. This is the crucial part. In 1878, 9 years after Ellen started the suffrage group in Nevada City and 6 years after the Ameses will leave California, State Senator Aaron August Sargent will introduce the 29 words that will eventually become the 19th Amendment and give women the right to vote. That amendment, also known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, will be introduced to the Senate floor every year for the following 40 years, unsuccessfully. Not until 1918, will it finally pass the Senate. Not until 1920 will it finally receive the official ratification required by 38 states. So why in 1869 did the women's suffrage group back east split in two? Women's rights had taken a backseat to the abolition movement during the Civil War. The national women's rights conferences had ceased occurring. In 1863, while Charles and Fanny were busy getting married in Ohio, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and others formed a national organization called the Women's National Loyal League in Stanton's New York City. The annual National Women's Rights Conventions didn't reconvene again until 3 years later, in 1866, a year after the war ended. That was right as Fanny was traveling to California. The 11th convention also took place in New York City. Up until that time, the abolitionists and the suffragists had been working together. But trouble started in 1866 with the adoption of the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Civil War emancipated the slaves, but it didn't give them citizenship or the right to vote. The 14th Amendment only guaranteed males over 21 years of age citizenship and equal protection under the laws regardless of race. The amendment didn't give women citizenship. That specification, that only males could be citizens, carried over to the proposal for the 15th Amendment, which would give only citizens the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The exclusion of women, of course, infuriated the women's rights activists. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton fought against the 15th Amendment. They insisted that it include women as citizens. But Lucy Stone, Henry Brown Blackwell, and their Boston buddies, including Julia Ward Howe and Mary Livermore, believed that if the women's issue was linked to the racial issue, the women in the South would turn against them and the 15th Amendment would fail. Lucy's group thought it was better to fight the women's rights issue state by state rather than on the national level. So the women formed two groups. Anthony and Stanton called their group the National Women's Suffrage Association, or NWSA. They elected Ellen Clark Sargent out in California to be treasurer. Ellen was a friend of Susan B. Lucy Stone's group, however, called their organization the American Women Suffrage Association, or AWSA. They started a weekly magazine called the Women's Journal, which they published out of Boston. Their friend, Mary Livermore, who, as mentioned, was from the Boston area but living in Chicago at the time, started a similar publication called The Agitator, which she published out of Chicago. When Mary later moves back to Boston, these two magazines will merge into one. Charles and Fanny supported Lucy's group, the AWSA, even though they would remain friends with members from both groups. The AWSA allowed men to belong, whereas the NWSA did not. The AWSA was a much larger group than the NWSA. But years later, when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton write the history of the women's rights movement, they will leave out that fact. As history shows, the stance taken by the larger AWSA won out. Women's rights were not included in the 15th Amendment. Still, the amendment barely passed. In February 1870, Georgia, Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas ratified the 15th Amendment, bringing the total of ratifying states to 29, only one more than the required 28 ratifications needed from the 37 states. So how is this being carried out in California? Right after the split in the women's suffrage organizations, Emily Pitts Stevens, Ellen Sargent, and a small group of women that probably included Laura DeForest Gordon founded the California Woman Suffrage Association. They chose Ellen Sargent to be their first president. 2 years later, in 1871, that association invited Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to speak in Santa Cruz. Georgiana Kirby reported on that event, but I haven't found any records showing how or if Fanny and Charles were involved. They were dealing with some serious personal issues at the time. Charles's 27-year-old adopted daughter, Serena Ames Wright, had recently passed away after suffering from pneumonia and pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the lungs. She left behind 2 living children. A third child, a little boy, had died 8 months before Serena. Then in March of 1870, Charles and Fanny had a baby themselves, whom they named Theodore after Reverend Parker. But 3 months after Theodore's first birthday, he passed away. That was in 1871, the year Anthony and Stanton were speaking in Santa Cruz. Charles Wilberforce was 16 when Theodore died. Alice was 5. Many years later, she would write in her epilogue to Charles's spiritual autobiography, "Here, too, came the birth and death of little Theodore, the child with the glowing eyes of the Sistine baby, whose brief life left an exquisitely sensitive spot in the family consciousness, like a wonderful promise unfulfilled." A few months after that, Charlie Wilberforce left home for high school, leaving Alice home alone. Their father accompanied George W. on the new transcontinental train to Minneapolis, where Charlie would live with his sister, Serena's widower, George Wright. George already had a new wife named Carrie. Mary, Serena Wright, was 10, and Vernon Ames Wright was 8. Charles and Vernon will develop a close relationship that will last the rest of their lives. The letters written between Charles W. and Charles G. during their time apart are preserved in the Ames Family Historical Collection housed in Radcliffe's Schlesinger Library. Someday, I hope to return to the library with time to read them. I'm sure they will tell us much more about Charles and Fanny's time in California. Because no sooner had Charles returned to California when the Unitarian Church called him to Philadelphia. Alice had turned 6. This time the whole family traveled by railroad. All right, so there we are with that chapter of Charles and Fanny's life. Now to go to Philadelphia, they're going to take on completely different roles. They will continue with helping with the Unitarian movement, but Fanny is going to become one of the world's first social workers. And Charles and Fanny together are going to start some social work programs. Charles and Fanny arrived in Philadelphia right before the Panic of 1873 hit the nation. Their concerns are going to flip from the women's rights issue to urban poverty, particularly child labor. Watch for that, and we'll see you then. Thanks, bye. As usual, if you got anything out of this video, please press the little thumbs up button. If you want to be notified when the next video comes out, you need to subscribe. Just give them your email. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. Press the little bell, and that will give you a notification. The book will be available on Amazon soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.